Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. As you may know by now, the Bureau is dedicated to collecting, recollecting half-lost, half-forgotten, half-remembered countercultural stories. And here we are in Soho, one of the centres of countercultural London back in the 50s and 60s. And in today's episode, we hear stories from and of the Flamingo Club, a nightclub in Soho. First of all in Coventry Street and then more famously in Wardour Street. It lasted from about 1952 to 1969. Listen to this for a roll call of some of the musicians who played there. Dizzy Gillespie, Rod Stewart, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Zoot Money, John Mayall, Eric Clapton, The Rolling Stones, who are they? The Moody Blues, The Animals, Mick Fleetwood, Cream, Atomic Rooster, Pink Floyd, Alexis Corner, Brian Auger, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, Long John Baldry, The Small Faces, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday, Tubby Hayes. Amazing. It was also a radical club in the sense of what it did for black music in London, as we shall hear. But our guide to the Flamingo Club is our old friend. He's back for more. Pete Watts, blogger extraordinaire, music journalist, cultural commentator, author, and all sorts of other things. Welcome back, Pete. Shall we just dive straight into the story of this amazing club?
Yeah, I mean, I love the Flamingo. I think I first got interested in Flamingo when I was interviewing Pete Townsend about the Marquee, because I was writing a piece for Uncut magazine about the Marquee, and his sort of first sort of words to me were, I didn't give a shit about the Marquee. For me, it was all about Flamingo. And to sort of, get such a response made me want to know a bit more. And the Flamingo was the kind of coolest venue in London in 62, 63, 64. But in a way that maybe it's kind of harder to appreciate at this distance in what it was doing. And that's what we'll talk about, hopefully, through this show. It was an R&B club. It was a mixed club. It had a mixed clientele. And it played very, very cool music from America and British bands who were trying to emulate that.
So it started in 1962?
It started in the early 50s as a fairly traditional jazz club, a hotel, sort of hotel jazz club in Coventry Street by a guy called Geoffrey Kruger. But these two brothers, Rick and Johnny Gunnell, came in, who were, as far as I can tell, they were jazz fans, but they were pretty street, and they came up with the idea of holding all-nighters. Presumably they got the idea from America, or maybe even from France, I'm not entirely sure, but they brought in all-nighters, and that was what the Flamingo became famous for. It became especially famous when it moved to Wardour Street in 57 or 58.
What was involved with doing an all-nighter at that time? Because I suppose having grown up in sort of Britain where like pubs were shut on Sundays for 3 hours and got kicked out at 10:30, I imagine that being quite complicated, was it, to get a licence to do an all-night club in central London?
Well, I think the key was that they didn't have a licence. I mean, I think they had a dancing licence, but they didn't have a drinks licence. So the Flamingo was unlicensed. That didn't mean you couldn't get intoxicating liquors and other substances on the premises, but it didn't have a drinks licence, which I think is probably what made it easy to do. The main deal was it opened at sort of 10 p.m. And there were two bands, they rotated, and you danced until dawn.
So you would have to bring your own intoxication, or there would be some illegal stuff going on, I assume?
Yeah. I mean, I think the drugs thing about the Flamingo is interesting, and the drink. I think that there were people on the premises who would supply you with your needs. I think it was one of the few places, certainly in central London, where people were openly smoking weed. There were pills going around, and you could get an expensive. They used to sort of, with a knowing phrase, you can get an expensive Coke at the bar, and that would often have maybe a little bit of something else in it to keep you going.
Maybe you can describe Soho at that time, because I mean, the sort of 50s Soho was quite different than Soho now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, not having been there, it's hard to imagine. I mean, it would have been pretty rough. It would have been in a red light district to quite a large degree. But also there would have been a lot of sort of normal shops and premises, and a lot of the that Flamingo, I think, took over an old grocer's basement warehouse. There was a lot of these spaces that had been used for storage, for the various street markets in the area that were no longer needed, perhaps quite the same way, and that's where the club sort of came in. It was also, it was very, very cool in that you had various other jazz venues in the area. The Flamingo, you had Ronnie Scott's just sort of around the corner, and you had the 100 Club not too far away. So it was part of that sort of scene. You had Two Eyes was around the corner as well on Old Compton Street. There was that nightlife thing going on in Soho as it was reinventing itself in the 50s.
Yeah, I mean the 100 Club and Ronnie Scott's still with us in sort of different forms, aren't they,
absolutely.
actually? But rare that anything else is. I mean, Soho, it's had a long history of stuff, Soho, and its fortunes have kind of risen and fallen. And, currently, as we were just talking a minute ago, I mean, it's now kind of media place and all that. But Soho sort of exists, I think, in reality and in your mind. I think most people who've come to London, when I came to London, I wasn't born here, unlike you, they've got their version of Soho, maybe less so these days because it has changed so much, but it's a bit like the Soho that you first encounter when you come to London, and that's how you remember it. And I think the most common thing I hear said about Soho is, it's changed.
Yeah.
It's not what it used to be.
Yeah.
We did an interview, interestingly, with Norman from Coach and Horses,
Oh, right.
Norman Bell, the famously the rudest landlord in the country, and he retired, and he's completely unsentimental about Soho. You expect him to be sort of, it's not what it used to be, but he's like, no, it's changed, and it's always changed, and that's the way it should be. We can get sentimental about it and look at it through those kind of the sort of reverse telescope sort of thing. But the period you're talking about, from this distance, particularly the 50s, it did seem to be very exotic. I mean, even then, at a time long before multiculturalism, it was quite a ethnically mixed area, wasn't it? Maltese gangsters and Italians and French people and all that. So it was a proper melting pot, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean Soho had been that since almost since it was sort of created as a district, and that was sort of always made it sort of distinct from Covent Garden and Mayfair. The areas sort of immediately surrounding it. It was this very multicultural area, a lot of Italians and lots of French traditionally, and Maltese. And that definitely allowed, maybe a sort of more vivacious nightlife to build up. Perhaps because the people who lived there were maybe slightly poorer and couldn't complain about the noise. Right. Rents were cheaper. And it was just generally more sort of welcoming and open to that sort of idea of a nightlife.
And it also, right back until the Victorian times, been associated with vice, hasn't it? Prostitution, particularly, I suppose, and gambling and all that sort of stuff, which is sort of a little bit of it still left. And so it's kind of fertile ground for a sort of underground jazzy club, wasn't it?
Especially an all-nighter. I mean, one of the reasons I think that Flamingo was so popular and successful was that it was a place for the night workers of London to go after they'd finished working at their clubs, bars, and theatres. They could go there. Then they could have an evening, and that was unique. Apart from, I presume, there were a fair number of sort of 24-hour illegal drinking dens of various kinds and members clubs. But for the if you worked on the door, you probably wouldn't have access to those sort of places, but you could go to the Flamingo. Right,
so let's talk about the crowd. So you've got that kind of the evening workers, the night workers who are servicing the rest of us, or the rest of us then. And then, they finish work, they want to go somewhere, they want to have a drink, they want to relax, they want to hang out, meet people.
Absolutely,
absolutely. So they were a big part of the clientele. Who else then?
So you had, the other thing about Flamingo, I guess, is that it changed. So it started off as a jazz venue. Then it did these all-nighters, and then as the 50s turned into the 60s, it became an R&B venue, which was basically soul music, sort of. And so with that, you got a change in clientele. But what was significant about Flamingo was that it had a large black audience. And that was first American GIs, who had quite a significant presence, I still think, in London at that point.
They
were, yeah, and they had their own clubs as well. And so some of the bands who played Flamingo would then go and play the GI clubs. So they had, this was one of the places they went because it was playing the music that they liked from home. But they were eventually banned after one too many violent incidences at the Flamingo. But there was also the British black population would go there, so the West Indians. That was where they would go, most of whom were probably out in West and South London in, I guess, black-run, enterprises. This was a white-run place where the blacks were happy to go, which is, I don't know, but I think it's probably quite unusual. And it's where black and white people mix, which is, again, I think at that time, quite unusual.
That's very interesting. I didn't realise that GIs were still around in London at the time. I mean,
it's one of those things, it depends who you talk about. Some of them say that, they never saw a GI there. Others say that the GIs made a significant part of the audience, and that, and some of the musicians remember playing these GI venues as a result of being at the Flamingo.
And the people who are running it, if they were jazz fans or R&B fans, and presumably listening to a lot of American music made by black artists. So they were playing that stuff. And so obviously you got your hipster beats type whiteys, the late night workers, and then that's interesting that you got a black audience as well, maybe coming up from Brixton or from West London, coming up west to a part of town which I wouldn't suppose at that time you really associated with their culture at all, right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and I think that the other jazz venues were pretty white. I mean, I think generally speaking. So I think this is what makes it really unusual and an interesting place. And it was all about the music that was being played. That's the other thing. It was about the all-nighters and the fact this was a place they could go, and everyone felt welcome to a certain extent. But also it's because it was playing music that a lot of people liked, which was hard to find elsewhere.
So as ever, music providing this kind of, providing the medium for these people to mix together. Because I think it's important to think, Windrush. It's been in the news recently a lot here, isn't it? And there's quite a lot of racism in this country towards black people at that time, isn't it? And so quite divided communities and a rare opportunity for mixing.
I think so. I mean, one of the shames that when I wrote about Flamingo, I wrote a piece about it for Uncut magazine, is that I couldn't find any black people to talk about their memories of it. Most of the people I spoke to were white musicians generally, and I'd like to have known more about their perspective on it. There's certainly if either their individual or their folk memory, whether it even has a place in it.
Right, so what you're saying there is that for white people, it was important that there was a black audience there because for them that was like a valuable cultural mix. For the black community, maybe the Flamingo wasn't a big deal in a way. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know. That's the thing. That's what I'd like to know more about. I'd like to know. I think certainly for the whites, it was great for them, especially because they love the music, and they weren't just playing it to a white audience and also they weren't just playing it with other white musicians. The bands themselves were fairly mixed at this point, which again was something that, you sort of didn't have quite so much later on in the 60s, when music became music certainly fragmented into white and black.
Let's have a tune then. One of the artists who played at the Flamingo. This is the Folk Brothers with Prince Buster and the All-Stars, Oh Carolina. Tell us about that track, Pete.
Well, that's one of the. There's an album which has a sort of some of his favourite tracks that were played at the Flamingo, and that's one of them. And as you say, it's a ska track basically, and I think this was one of the first places in London, certainly in West End, where you could listen to ska music. They had a ska night, or a blue beat, I think it was called at the time. There was a blue beat night there, and they played songs like that, like "Oh Carolina," and some of the white bands, or some of the bands who played the Flamingo, and you had two types of bands who played the Flamingo. You had brilliant touring artists like Screaming Jay Hawkins and Wilson Pickett and Johnny Hooker and Little Stevie Wonder would all play the Flamingo. And you also had British bands who were kind of playing an approximation of that music, like Georgie Fame and Zoot Money. And Ronnie Knight and the Night Riders, I think they were called, or the Night Timers. And a lot of those bands would also play ska. Early '60s, you've got generally white bands playing ska music. I think that's quite, maybe not so well known that was going on. And the Flamingo also had black DJs as well.
Right. So let's come back to that one. That's an interesting one. But so the other part of the audience then presumably is white musicians who were attracted to this club because of the music that's being played there, and then are kind of like soaking it up and reinventing themselves, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. There was a huge audience of musicians there, white musicians there. I spoke to Zoot Money, who later was one of the sort of headline acts there, and he'd heard about Georgie Fame and he'd heard about this club, and he was at a gig. He lived down on the south coast somewhere. He heard about, I think Ray Charles was playing at the Astoria, Finsbury Park, or the Rainbow, whatever it was called. And then on the way back, he stopped at the Flamingo, and he wanted to experience this music and this culture and this club that he'd heard so much about. And loads of musicians went there. I think Nick Drake would make pilgrimages into London to go there. As I say, Pete Townsend loved going there. And because you had two bands playing for the all-nighters, that band would then stay and watch and listen to the music because there's nowhere else they could really go at that time in Soho. there was literally nowhere else to go. So they would also, and that was, I think, quite unusual. Normally bands didn't really watch each other that much. They certainly didn't hang out in the club, but they had no choice. So it was quite there was quite a lot of absorption, I think, of that going on.
First of all, Zoot Money sounds like he doesn't sound like he's from the south coast of England, does
he? yeah. When he took his name, he obviously changed his name, and that's the other thing. He took his name from Zoot Suits, and that's a kind of mod thing. And that was the other thing about the Flamingo, is that it became a very popular mod venue. So the other thing you had going on against the backdrop of the various audience we're talking about is the mod audience who came there, and they kind of developed there. I think, as far as I can tell, it wasn't really a mod venue, but if you were into that sort of music, you tended to be a mod, and that's where you'd go. What you had across the road from here in Ham Yard is the Scene, which opened at around sort of same time, 263, and that was very much a mod venue set up by and for mods. Whereas Flamingo was just a place that played that music that mods could go to and enjoy.
What is a mod? Let's try and. I think we know what a rocker is, but what's a mod?
What's a mod? Oh god! You should really ask a mod that, and they'll tell you. They'll tell you in a sort of great detail what a mod is. For me, a mod is a certain way of dressing, a certain outlook on life, generally liking, sort of what was originally sort of modern jazz, and then that's sort of moving into sort of soul and R&B. And it was about a lifestyle and outlook on life, and maybe sort of more ambitious outlook on life than maybe a traditional.
Very sharp dressed.
Very sharp dressed. Clothes very important.
Accessories very important.
Yeah.
Barry Kane had an interesting theory, which I love it. I don't know whether actually it's ever been established as being fact, but he's talking about the way that working class lads started to dress super sharp at the end of the 50s and early 60s, and he put it down to the fact that a lot of them had a lot of traditional London terraced houses have been knocked down in working class areas, and council flats have been built, which we know is the case post-war. And it was the first time that you could have a full-length mirror in the hall.
That's quite good, isn't it?
It is good.
Yeah.
So if you were sort of 17, 18, you could check out. You had to check out, in fact, your entire look, not just the top bit in the bathroom mirror.
Yeah.
So you get these kids basically spending most of their disposable income on super sharp suits.
Yeah.
You might get that suit even in Savile Row or from a Soho tailor around the corner, right? And then you'd be down a club like the Flamingo or the Scene, listening to that music.
Yeah, and I've talked to musicians, and they talk about the first time they saw a coloured item of clothing in a shop. Like they were so used to everything being kind of monochrome that it was. That in itself was exciting and kind of aspirational.
I mean, you mentioned Pete Townsend, of course. A mod band who turned into rockers later, and quite a few of those bands did that. So, though for those bands like Pete Townsend, that was somewhere that he went to become Pete Townsend. Is it rather than he went there as a sort of fully fledged rock royalty?
Yeah, no, he definitely. This is sort of early 60s, so we're talking 62, 63. I mean, Georgie Fame was the kind of important influence on the Flamingo. He was the guy who kind of defined the Flamingo sound, which was the mod sound, which was kind of Green Onions basically. An organ and a vocal and a guitar. That was the Flamingo sound, and that was the mod sound. So that's where mods like Pete Townsend would go.
Let's have a listen to Georgie Fame at the Flamingo.
Yeah, here we go now. Georgie Fame, the Blue Flames, and let's listen to Night Train. Miami, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, Raleigh, North Carolina, Washington, D.C. All aboard!
Brilliant, isn't it? I mean,
it's
coming down the years, it still sounds hot and so groovy, and it doesn't take much imagination to imagine a Soho basement, high on uppers.
You can imagine how exciting that was. I mean, because before I wrote about the Flamingo, I didn't really know a great deal about Georgie Fame beyond his name. And, in my mind, he was like one of those sort of British pastiche kind of rockers, really, or or maybe a crooner. I didn't realise he had, such a cool groove, really, with his band. I mean, his vocals are kind of interesting and sort of an English attempt to be American, but the groove of the band is fabulous. And yeah, you can totally get the the espresso machine and the people dancing and the jumping around. It's just got a great vibe, and very, very different to what was going on in other parts of the country. I mean, you're sort of thinking at this time, you've got up in Liverpool, you got what the Beatles were doing was far removed from this, really. I mean, very interesting and obviously amazing and brilliant. But this was a really London. This could only really have happened in London, I think. And it's just a lovely sound. I mean, I guess the thing is, it was all covers. There wasn't really anyone attempting to write British versions of this music at this point.
I mean, I suppose you've got skiffle going on as well, haven't you? In other places?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of post skiffle, so skiffle had kind of become this. And yeah, I mean, I think what you can also tell from listening to Georgie Fame is that it just had a really good ear for good, he had a good ear for a sound. His whole first album was recorded live at the Flamingo. Glyn Johns was the engineer. Glyn Johns, sort of very famous record producer in later years. He was the engineer. It's a pretty rough and ready sound. The voice you heard right at the beginning was Rick Gunnell announcing the band. So and you can hear the audience. You can get a real, it really has got a good vibe. I mean, it flopped, and Georgie Fame didn't really have a hit. He was playing the Flamingo for 2 years, a major draw, but he couldn't translate that because there was no audience for it outside the Flamingo, until he kind of wrote a novelty pop song, which then it became his sort of that became his world. I mean, in that band also he had some really interesting people. So in the very first version of the Blue Flame, you had John McLaughlin was on guitar. John McLaughlin later played with Miles Davis, like one of the greatest jazz guitarists of all time. These were people who were. That's the other thing. A lot of these were jazz musicians who couldn't really anymore get a living playing jazz, but could get a living if they played jazz and R&B, and quite liked R&B, so we're quite happy to do that. So they're what I mean is that they're very good musicians. They're not kind of skiffle band musicians, I guess is what I'm saying. They're jazzers. A lot of the drummers, Ginger Baker was playing here. There's a lot of good jazz musicians were playing R&B, and that makes for what is a really good vibe, I think.
You're right. I mean, Georgie Fame went on, and he's still going, isn't he? I mean,
he's still going.
Plays keyboards for Van Morrison.
My mum went and saw him quite recently, last year. Actually, I think he's playing in Guildford.
And he plays keys for Van Morrison, or did for a while anyway. And of course, Van Morrison influenced by that sort of stuff as well, wasn't he?
Yes, totally. Yeah.
As you said elsewhere, I mean, and listening to that, it is a sort of American pastiche, isn't it? And of course, you've made the point elsewhere is that the sort of British version of it is a couple of years down the line, isn't it? And maybe even took another club like the UFO, which we talked about, to sort of invent a kind of British thing instead. But so it's this incredible fertile ground. But I mean, just talk about some of those other American artists that came over. I mean, you listed some earlier, but let's go through them because it was. I mean, this is a small club.
I'd love to know more about this because, I presume that, there weren't that many venues that were interested in having people like this, like Screaming Jay Hawkins over, or even Stevie Wonder. But obviously, the Gunnells had good ears. I think they ran their own booking agency as well. So presumably they were tapped into, they knew who was going to be around. And they kind of built a little circuit, I think, of venues. There was, I think there was Ricky Ticky's they ran, and there was another one. There were a few venues. There was Peter Stringfellow's club up in Sheffield, the King Mojo. There was one up in Newcastle, I forget its name now. But there was a little circuit of these venues that were playing this music where if you could get an American touring artist over, you could then send them up and make enough money for them to be worthwhile. And that was how they got these guys over.
And well, let's just go through them. Some of the people that did get over. I mean, it's we could go through that list. It's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah. So Stevie Wonder, little Stevie Wonder as he was then. Screaming Jay Hawkins. I think there's a story that when Screaming Jay Hawkins played, he kind of was brought onto the stage in a coffin, and then he kind of arose from the coffin and started bellowing out his songs. I think Solomon Burke played there. And you had sort of John Lee Hooker. I think some of the more sort of traditional blues artists also played there. It was an incredible snapshot. So for a lot of musicians who weren't just there playing the all-nighters, this was also a chance for them to see these guys who they'd only ever heard on record before.
Did you mention Ella Fitzgerald?
Yeah. When it was a jazz venue, I think. Yeah,
absolutely amazing. Isn't it? I think Hank Langford, I think he mentioned being there when Solomon Burke was playing. Solomon Burke, the giant, hugely
guy,
fat guy, and he said there was a woman behind him shouting at the top of her voice, "I want to fuck you, I want to fuck you," all the way through the song. And there's this, and I think he came on stage and he had his own throne.
Yeah, that's what he used to do,
and a crown. Yeah.
And,
the king of R&B. Sam also said, I mean, we talked about it earlier, that there were regular raids by the sort of the Soho police. Of course, it's well known now, and this is no secret, that the police in Soho were totally, the Vice Corps were totally bent, weren't they? I mean, that's the sort of accepted fact by the police. So the raids presumably would have been either in prompting of some, politician or some local official, or just a kind of rinse down money-making exercise, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's difficult to talk about this without my lawyers being present, but I think the Gunnels were kind of, I don't know. I think that they had an understanding of that world, perhaps, and there were times maybe when these raids were also retribution, perhaps for things not being done the way they should have been done. There's some great pictures of the Flamingo being raided, but when you interviewing people, they don't remember witnessing that many raids. It was always a problem. But other people have said that one of the things about Flamingo was that the police were quite happy generally, because they knew that if all the kind of Soho demi-monde were in one place, then at least they knew where they were, and that was kind of preferable to having them out in the streets where they might corrupt, normal people. So it's difficult. You get, as ever with these things, you get sort of different recollections of what was going on. There definitely were, there were incidents. I mean, there was a very famous incident involving Christine Keeler at the Flamingo.
Let's talk about that. I mean, for people who don't know, Christine Keeler was.
So Christine Keeler was the woman involved in the Profumo scandal. She had an affair with John Profumo, the Secretary of War, was it? Secretary of Defence? While she was also having an affair with a Soviet sort of naval attaché. But she was a regular at the Flamingo in the sort of 61, 62, 63. She worked in Soho in various clubs and bars. And so she was one of those people who would go down there for after her shift. And she, two of her former boyfriends happened to come across each other at Flamingo, and an altercation ensued. I think one of them ended up with stitches, got slashed in the face, got several stitches, and in retribution, he went to her house where she was with her new boyfriend, fired shots. And in the ensuing kind of investigation, the Profumo scandal sort of came to light.
And did it nearly bring the government down or something at one point?
Yeah. I mean, it brought down. It essentially brought down a change of government. I mean, it's not immediate, but it certainly was a massive change in people's maybe awareness of what politicians could get up to.
And it became a sort of signal story from the 60s, didn't it, with the film Scandal and all that later?
Yes, totally.
She became a kind of pin-up, wasn't it?
And it was a watershed. It was a watershed moment. Yeah, and obviously she was a pin-up, but she was a regular at the at the Flamingo. It's one of the places. She's also a regular at UFO, actually, which is quite interesting.
Sam Hutt said that on the drug front, he said at the Flamingo, I don't know whether it was the Gunnels or somebody else, just the MC, but they'd obviously get warning of a raid coming. So you'd interrupt the band and tell everybody they're on the way, and then there'd be this kind of shower of kind of the scattering of kind of noises as all these pills were hitting the floor. By the time the police came, they sort of walked through the stage with crunching away on various medication. And
well, you can imagine they had lookouts up there. I mean, it was a basement club. It was on Wardour Street. It was on the sort of Chinatown side of Wardour Street, really. So it's kind of not quite Soho, really. But they would have, and also, it was at the time of night when there weren't that many people around. So it would have been very difficult for the police to have mounted a raid without being spotted.
Yeah, and then they'd sort of maybe pick somebody up just for form's sake and haul them off, and then as soon as they're gone, the band would start up again, and business would be resumed.
There does seem to have been, a surprising degree of tolerance for what was going on there.
I think what you said earlier is probably true, isn't it? Is that the police? I mean, look, let's be honest. I mean, they're still the same now, really, aren't they? They can't admit it officially, but they prefer to compartmentalise it. It's going on here. We kind of know about it, but as long as it's here and nobody's getting hurt and it's it's doing its own thing, we'll kind of leave it in peace generally.
Yeah, and I think in the West End, I think the police have had to take that attitude. I interviewed a club owner recently, and he said, what people knew, what the police knew, and what the punter knew is that you couldn't buy on our premises, But if you brought stuff in, then that was legit. You could carry stuff, but you couldn't, as long as there weren't people actually selling in the club, then that was fine. Because I think that then became dangerous for the club owners. So maybe it was the same at Flamingo. I don't know whether people bought on the streets and then came in again.
Yeah, I mean, you get the impression, say, talking, about, say, Paul Raymond and stuff later, that there was a kind of reciprocal arrangement between the movers and shakers and the property owners and the promoters and, in Soho and the police. And, of course, it got very dodgy, I think, didn't it, with the Vice Squad, and there was a big shake-up in the 70s and much later on. So going back to Flamingo, Pete, so you've got this incredible situation, mixed audience, mixed cultures, music coming in from the States, run by these two brothers who are obviously massive music fans and presumably quite well connected to get these artists over. You've got people like Pete Townsend and coming along and sort of, getting their creative juices flowing. So what happened next? I mean, as it's going into the kind of mid-60s, how's it looking in there?
Well, I mean, I think the Flamingo was remarkably consistent, and perhaps possibly to a fault, in that it had its signature sound and it stuck with it as the music world was changing. It perhaps didn't sort of embrace the changes that were coming with 65, 66, with Revolver and a shift in emphasis in music until it was too late. So through that period, it continued to, so it had, after Georgie Fame sort of became too big and moved on, Zoot Money came in and did the same thing, and then there was Ronnie Knight and the Nighttimers did the same thing. They brought in John Mayall's Blues Breakers, who were a slightly different version, but essentially were still doing that thing. I think that they were frowned upon because they didn't have an organ. You also had bands like the Graham Bond organisation, a fantastic heavy R&B band who were playing there. But as music was going overground, I guess, in a lot of ways, with pop and Small Faces and The Who and the Kinks, they weren't really able to bring those sort of bands in. I think that was the thing, is that you didn't really see those bands appearing there. The Stones played there. I mean, this is an interesting point, really, is that the Stones played there, and they were a disaster because they were just too messy and too shambolic, both in appearance and musically, for the Flamingo audience, which wanted a very tight sound, as you could hear on Georgie Fame. And Georgie Fame kind of, his band kind of looks as he sounds, very sharp.
Well, you can imagine you've got mods there. I mean, super sharp dressed.
Absolutely.
And then it's got this whole legacy of people like Ella Fitzgerald and stuff coming over, this jazz club. I mean, they were used to like top draw American musicians.
Yeah.
And so a sort of, bratish youngst, people like the Stones and stuff at that time were kind of imitating American music and sort of, quite shambolically so, would have seemed like amateurs, I guess. Right?
I think exactly that. I mean, the Stones were seen exactly as that, as amateurs. And what you did have is very nearby is the Marquee, which was much more welcoming to that sort of band, that sort of music. And so the Marquee kind of took over at that point, because that's where the Who and the Faces, Small Faces, and the Stones would play. The Flamingo was, it just, their music wasn't good. I can't remember who told me about this, but they said, the problem with the Flamingo was that it was like all those people who wanted to be in bands like Georgie Fame, they weren't good enough, they say it was they were up, their nose was against the window, they couldn't play there, so they went to the Marquee, where they became absolutely, obviously huge and vital. And the Flamingo almost became a victim of its own success in a strange way, or its own standards, its own very high standards couldn't be met by the music that was coming after it. Let's have a listen to Zoot Money, because his story is interesting in terms of this club and what happened next, isn't it?
Started off a newsboy on a paper. For a time I worked down the elevator. All the time I knew that later I would be a higher rater. And finally a big time operator. an excavator. I became a wine and brandy waiter. Built I am a decorator, and I was an estimator. I'm gonna be a big time operator. Oh, yes I am. Oh yeah. I'm gonna be so big time. You don't understand, woman. I'm gonna be so big. You won't even look in my face. I'm gonna be a whole lot of people working for me now. Yeah. Yeah. Now listen to me. I'm telling you the truth. On the job as an airline navigator.
Super cool, isn't it? I mean, amazing and super sharp. You know, they can do it. He still sounds a bit American, I guess. But I mean,
But you can totally hear the lineage from the Georgie fame, isn't there? I mean, it's the same. It's the same vibe.
and of course, interesting with Zoot Money because, as we've talked about before, he reinvented himself, didn't he, for the new generation.
So he sort of changed his band and became Dantilion's Chariot, which was his kind of psychedelic, and he played UFO as that. I don't know how seriously he was taken. Actually, he was an example of someone who was trying desperately to catch what was going on. I mean, the other problem with the Flamingo is, I guess, if you listen to that, you can hear the kind of importance of the horns and the organ. You know, it requires a lot more musicians than you had in the new bands, which are generally 3 or 4 piece. Certainly, you know, nearly most of them are 4 piece. These are sort of 7 or 8 pieces quite often. And also, music was getting bigger, and the sounds were getting bigger, and it was just venues like the Flamingo just weren't big enough. I mean, you know, they just simply weren't physically big enough to hold bands of, you know, the sound, that kind of sound.
So whereas Georgie Fame had gone off with his, you know, sort of like novelty record and made it big in a different kind of way. So for somebody like Zoot Money, who's, you know, ambitious young guy, and he's looking over towards Tottenham Court Road and UFO and seeing what all the new kids are doing. And maybe
and you know, in a lot of sense, that's what a lot of music is about, isn't it? It's about sort of following trends, and you know, you can't always get there first, but you certainly don't want to get there last. And yeah, he was one of those who was trying to do that. Others did it in different ways. I mean, you know, one of the bands who sort of came out of Flamingo were Cream, because, you know, all the members of Cream had played at bands who were big at the Flamingo. They kind of formulated their sound there to a certain extent, but then they were way too big to play the Flamingo. So that was a sound that came from that club.
And people like Ginger Baker, obviously, and then
Yeah.
you know, went on to be, you know, part of that whole scene in a different way, didn't he? You mentioned John McLaughlin and Steve Winwood.
Yeah, he would have played there. God, I can't remember what band he was in. He played there. I mean, I think can't remember who he played there with. Most of them did play there. I mean, Clapton played there, you know, and obviously, you know, then that's where him and Baker kind of hit it off. It was a place where everyone who then became anyone would play, but they would not play that kind of music at that venue. I think that's the important thing. It didn't happen there. It then they went somewhere else. They went to the Marquee, or they went to the 100 Club, or they went to, you know, bigger venues generally.
And I guess the audience themselves would start to move, wouldn't they? You know, if something else is happening down the road, which is super groovy and super hip, you know, then the audience themselves, maybe a younger audience, starts to go there. Right?
I mean, a scene only has a quite short, you know, shelf life, generally speaking. You know, before people grow up, and people just grow up and move on. You know, they can't keep doing what they did in their early 20s, and the younger people aren't interested in what their sort of elder peers did.
So what happened to the Flamingo?
The Flamingo, well, you know, much like Zoot Money, it tried desperately to kind of cash in on the changing environment around it, and it renamed itself the Pink Flamingo, painted itself pink, and tried to become a psychedelic club, but it just didn't work. It wasn't authentic. It wasn't real. It then, I think the Gunnels then lost control of it. I'm not quite sure, but it became the Temple. And the Temple seems to be quite interesting in that quite a lot of kind of early sort of like Queen played there, and bands like that, sort of bands who had become quite big in the 70s, and sort of in that prog scene maybe, they played there. But by all accounts, it was a dive. You know, it had lost. You know, it hadn't been done up in God knows how long, and a bit of pink on the walls isn't going to change that. So it was no longer a cool place to play, and it certainly lost its original focus, which was that sound and that audience. There were other places that were doing that. I mean, UFO himself was an all-nighter. What
is it now? Do you know?
Now it's a branch of O'Neill's, I think.
What's O'Neill's?
The Irish pub. So it's that huge Irish pub on Wardour Street. It was in the basement there, and above it was the Whiskey A Go-Go, which was sort of more of a sort of traditional nightclub restaurant, which then became in the 80s the Wag Club, which was a very trendy club in the 80s.
So in that sort of psychogeographic way of that London and most cities probably have, the sort of ghost of it lived on in various incarnations,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, absolutely it did. It remained a venue up until the WAG closed, which I'm trying to think when that was. I think it was in the 90s. It might even have been in the early 2000s. Let's have a
listen to Graham Bond, because he and his organisation, his classic sort of 60s names in the Graham Bond organisation, he sort of epitomised it in his later years, right? Is that right?
Yeah. Well, John McLaughlin was in this band as well. So this was a band that were formed, again, out of the meetings of various different members of different bands. At Flamingo, they kind of liked each other's vibe, and they decided to then form their own band, Graham Bond and John McLaughlin.
Take all of my money, baby, you're good to me. And you treat me mean and funny, baby, you're good to me. Cause if you don't want to bother, that's alright with me. But if you call, then I holler, baby, you're good to me. Good to me. Good to me. You know I love you, honey, baby, you're good to me. No, I'm always thinking of you, baby, you're good to me. But they say you're bad, I tell them bad looks good to me. So come on now, what's to stop you, baby, be good to me. Good to me. Good to me. You know a way I'm feeling, baby, be good to me. So confused, my head is reeling, baby, be good to me. If you want me, then you say that this can never be. Try just once more and see, yeah, baby, you're good to me. Good to me. Good to me.
I mean, it's very groovy, and it's got sort of shades of, or premonitions, I suppose, really, of later sort of Soho scenes, doesn't it? Like easy listening and the acid jazz.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I was going to say, there's definitely you can hear the jazz there. I mean, you've got Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker on the rhythm section. You can really hear the jazz influence in that, much more, I think, than you can in the Georgie Fame and the Zoot Money, which is kind of a bit sort of harder. Yeah, and I would have thought that acid jazz would give itself a direct lineage back to the Flamingo. I mean, it'd be interesting to talk to Eddie Pillar about all that. He would probably be able to talk about that at some length. Absolutely.
And from your piece, you interviewed Zoot Money, and I love this thing he said about the place, which is now a theme pub, sort of, isn't it? A chain pub anyway. And he says, you said he still thinks there's some kind of magic about the place. It had an aura about it, he says. There are spirits still lurking in the basement, groovy spirits waiting for it to spark up again, and then people can come down and start dancing.
Yes, totally. Yeah, no, I really like that. And I talked to Jeff Dexter as well, the DJ who played at the Scene, and he also played there. And he sort of said, after the interview, he goes, I just want to go back down to the Flamingo right now, take some pills, find some girls and start dancing. He also said something great about the Flamingo, and he said if you went to Flamingo, you knew you'd find some trouble. And I said, well, what do you mean by trouble? And he goes, well, there's two kinds of trouble. There's the trouble you want, and there's the trouble you don't want. And you can get both kinds at the Flamingo.
Right, so the trouble you don't want would be like getting glassed by someone.
Yeah, that would be a bit of violence. And the trouble you want is maybe some interesting drugs or some female companionship for the night.
Well, who knows what they get up to in there now? We're probably having a K-League, dancing jigs and reels, maybe. You can check it out when it's open again. Perhaps they'll let you in the basement and you can try and soak up some of the sweaty atmosphere of days of yore. It's at 33 to 37 Wardour Street. That's it. Thanks very much to Pete Watts. You can check out Pete's work at his amazing blog, thegreatwen.com, W-E-N, for his writings on music, culture and London. We'll be back soon with more Tales from the Counterculture. We're going to finish with the track Flamingo, played by Kenny Graham's Afro-Cubists. They were the house band for a while at the Flamingo Club. Cheers, Pete.
Thank you very much.
Kenny Graham's Afro-Cubist, finishing this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture with the song Flamingo. You can check out more about what we do at www.bureauoflostculture.com. We'll be back next time with Tales from the Counterculture. Looking forward to seeing you, hearing you, or sharing this virtual space with you then. Ta-ta.